Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberai, and we are thrilled to dive into storytelling today. Normally, we're talking politics, we're talking business, but none of that is possible without the ability to tell a good story. So there's no one better to talk to about this than Catherine Burns, New York Times bestselling author, former artistic director of the Moth, and a dear friend, even though we haven't personally known each other, Catherine, for like 20 years now. Because my wife and I, when we were dating in like the early 2000s, we would try to one up each other by going to events. And I was like the midtown dorky real estate guy who was like Carnegie Hall and political fundraisers are super romantic and fun. And she was like, let's go downtown to some grungy place because there's this new thing called the Moth and let's go listen to stories. And I got to say, I was a little skeptical, Catherine, at first, but I am now a true believer. So good to
Yay.
see you.
It's so good to see you. Yeah, we love Valerie, of
It's
course.
amazing. But look, let's level set. Tell the folks what is the Moth and how did you get tied in with them originally? Because I think that's a fun story too.
It is. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like a story of my heart. So, the Moth is all about True Stories Live. The Moth organization does like I think it has 600 storytelling shows all over the world a year, and they record those stories, and the best stories end up being broadcast out in the Moth Radio Hour, which is on public radio stations around the country and on the BBC, in the Moth's books, videos, and also the Moth's podcast. So I first heard about the Moth when I moved to New York City in 2000, and several of my friends just happened to know about it. And when I heard about this thing where people were standing on stage, real people telling stories from their own lives, I was so intrigued because at the time, I was working in film and television, where even the indie film, you would have 15 people in the room. Like it took so many people to tell a story. So I went to my first Moth event. Can remember it like it was yesterday. It was on a boat, and I sat there and watched person after person tell these beautiful, heartfelt stories with like just simple lighting, simple sound. The audience was so rapt, and I fell in love. And I started coming to all of the shows. And eventually, one of the Moth's two employees quit, and I waved my hand wildly and came on board. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just do this for a little while. I really love this organization. And blink, and 21 years went by.
Wow. Because I think Val was there in the early days, just
Really
interning
early,
when she was at NYU.
really early.
And
Yeah.
it was like I felt like we were kind of being exposed to it on the ground level because then it was just like this trajectory. So like did it evolve in a way that you ever thought was possible? Like did you like when you first were involved, were you like, oh, this is easily going to be a global storytelling event on public radio with live events and celebrities and all this kind of stuff?
I will say, like, from the early days, like the Moth actually started in the late 90s. George Doss Green was the founder, and he had all these amazing friends. And so very early on, the shows were like packed, and he would be getting people like George Plimpton and like
Yeah.
these huge, beautiful raconteurs. He was very connected, and his friends. So early on, like I feel like it was always very buzzy, like long before I came on
Yeah.
board. But I don't think that any of us, and the Moth is truly one of these organizations that was built up through a community of people, like such a labor of love for so many
Yeah.
people. And I don't know that any of us could have ever imagined where it goes. I feel so lucky. Like I feel like this thing that I loved and my friends loved, like you're making this thing that you all love that just somehow finds this incredible audience. And part of it was just like podcasting coming along, and it was just the perfect time for us because at that point we had almost 10 years of these shows recorded. So we were able to jump out and do, we were, I think I know this, when the Moth podcast launched, there were only 10,000 podcasts.
Oh my
There
God.
might be 10 million now. There's so many. I mean,
Wow.
literally, it's like insane. I haven't gotten like the latest amount of how many there are, but so it was actually possible to go in there and
Yeah.
find an audience.
Pioneers. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so one of the things that I find so interesting about what was created then, and I think kind of segues to what your role was it always felt so natural. Like people would come up there and it was like, wow, they were just like so remarkable. But a lot of work goes into telling a good story, right? So talk a little bit about behind the scenes, like what role you played, how the organization actually helped it. And I mean, you talk a little bit about it in like how to tell a story.
Yeah.
Amazing fun
Thank you.
read. But yeah, fill us in.
So yeah, so it's one of those things like when the Moth works well, the audience feels like they are just at the most wonderful dinner party,
Yeah.
and that the guests have just stepped up and are telling this story just from their heart, totally unpracticed. Like it should just sound very natural, like they're talking to their best friend. But actually, a lot of work, of course, goes into someone being able to do that, especially in front of a big crowd. So the stories in general aren't memorized,
Yeah.
but Moth directors, and there's many of them, and they're so wonderful, spend often many, many hours working with each storyteller. And first is like identifying the story they might want to tell, and then like what does the story mean to them, like why of all the stories are our life, and we all have thousands of them, is this the story they're going to tell tonight? Because if you can make us feel why you care so much about something, chances are we as an audience will care. And then really figuring out the beats of the stories, like where are you going to start, like we like to say, like who are you at the beginning of the story and who are you at the end of the story. Because I think most great moth stories have like some moment of change, like some little
Yeah.
shift where the person's perspective changed as a result of what happened. Now you have to be careful because you can go too far and you can get a little after school special, which I think it did under like some on my watch early, a little early on, but we
Yeah.
course corrected.
Yeah.
But but like so the person gets on stage and they can have the beats, like they know they're going to start here and move to here and move to
Gotcha.
here, but every time it comes out a little bit different.
Yeah. And I mean, the key things that I read about in the book are like you have to have kind of stakes, right? Like something has
Yes.
to be at stake, and then you have to have kind of a change pivot, but you also have like a time limit on this, right? I mean, it was like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Like 10, 12 minutes.
wow,
And yet stakes are what we say, like stakes are like what does the person have to win or lose,
yeah.
like what happens if they get what they want, what happens if they don't, what are the consequences. So just something that brings a little tension to the story.
Sure.
um,
Now, in that book, in All These Wonders, another book you were part of,
yeah.
I find you're kind of gravitating toward all these amazing stories. I mean, like, I'm sure it's impossible, but are there some standout stories, events over, better course of 2 decades that really kind of stood out to you, either because of who it was, the story, or maybe the journey they went on to get to the point of being able to tell a good story? Or,
Yeah, I mean, one show as a whole that I remember so well is before I actually worked at the Moth. They did stories of the civil rights movement,
oh,
and they had all these wonderful people who had known each other back in the day, and so you really felt the camaraderie between the storytellers, and it
hmm.
was so beautiful. And I just remember thinking, there's nowhere in the world I would rather be than sitting in this room right now. We were at the old Nell's, which no longer exists,
Oh,
down
yeah,
on 14th Street.
yeah.
Such a beautiful space, standing room only, and you just felt so lucky to be in that room. So that's the thing I really remember. I mean, another memorable moment for me was when we launched the Moth in Australia. And I don't know who we thought we were, but we ended up getting booked to do the main stage of the Sydney Opera House, which is
Amazing,
gigantic. And
amazing.
so we were just doing all this press, trying to get word out. We were part of a festival, thank goodness, but I was so
Yeah,
nervous. And I remember this moment where our producer at the time, Maggie Sino, came up to me and she was like, I made a decision. I decided that we're going to open up the seating on either side of the stage because they have this extra seating on either side of the stage. And I was like, why did you do that? And because I was so nervous, and I think she took it as a criticism, like, well, I just thought it was a good idea. And I was like, no, Maggie, why did they suggest we do that? And it was because we had sold out.
Oh my God, what a
And,
feeling.
and I just put my head down and
Oh
cried.
my God, what a feeling.
What a feeling. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So that
It's
was
amazing.
so beautiful. And one of the amazing things is we had this wonderful intern who had been part of our education program, whose mother was from Australia, and her grandparents were there. How sweet is that? And we called
That's,
them out from stage.
I love that. No, it's
Yeah.
amazing. It's like one of these things, like when I was going through the book too, you get through like half of the book, right, Catherine? And then it's like, well, there really is no right way to tell a story, right? And it was like this epiphany. I was like, what do you mean? I thought this was
Yeah.
gonna, but explain that, right? There is it's a puzzle. You have to kind of
The puzzle.
put in the work, right? Like,
Yeah,
there's no
and
like
everyone tells a
template,
story a
right?
little differently,
Yeah.
Some people, there are people who can like walk to the corner store and buy a gallon of milk and come back and somehow make a story out of it. But most of us are not that person. Like most of us have stories. Like when we're trying to figure out what stories someone might tell, we'll say, "What are the stories that, like, when you have a brand new friend, you can't wait to tell them?" Or what are the stories that your friends ask you to repeat to their friends?
Yeah.
Because usually there's something in that. And like the most important things, I mean, there's so many ways to start stories. Like some people tell it, like maybe this is a little in the weeds, but like in the first person, like, I'm standing in the middle of the desert, like it would really draw you in. whereas other people, don't do it quite that dramatically. But the most important thing is just to be yourself. I know that's almost sometimes I feel like that advice sounds annoying.
Yeah.
Like, what does that even mean? But it means like if you're not like the jokester, don't try to force yourself to be.
Yeah.
Like just let tell a story in a way that feels like how you talk in every day, because it's always going to be better than if you're trying to like imitate like a comedian that you saw on Comedy Central or something like that. Like just try to tell it the way you would tell it, like again, to your best friend over dinner.
Yeah. Now we talked about Sydney Opera House, small little boutique restaurant, standing room only. But then also during the pandemic, you had to do this kind of virtually, right? Talk a little bit about how much it matters to be able to have a live audience and to respond to them and to react, right? Like, how hard was that period of time to even tell a
It
good story?
it was so hard. I mean, of course, people were just like so separated, and
Yeah.
especially in those first weeks of lockdown. I jumped online, and what a lot of other storytelling shows jumped online very, very
Yeah.
quickly. And we had friends like there's this wonderful group called Daybreaker who do these sober dance parties at 6 a.m. And they very quickly, because they're so tech savvy, figured out their tech and how to do this. And so we ended up writing to them, being like, "Help!" Like because
I
they were
love
the ones who like really quickly figured out how you could do sound. But yeah, we did our very first Zoom show. I want to say in like early April,
Wow.
maybe. Yeah,
Right
like
out the gate.
yeah, we maybe it was like late April.
Yeah.
And we were just happy to have a way to connect. All the storytellers were in their living rooms. Like the entire Mott's production staff, shout out to them, had to instantly become like webinar producers, like overnight, like figure out how to do this. And so it was like better to connect in that way. I mean, one of the things that was really magical was the chat. We would generally turn the chat off during stories because it felt like people were talking over the
Yeah.
storytellers. But at intermission, we turn on the chat and people would just be like,
Oh,
just so happy to be
amazing.
in this space. But one nice thing was like as soon as New York City was like, okay, 25 people could be in a room, we were able to move the show to Greenwood Cemetery, which is
Oh,
this beautiful
amazing
old
venue.
Gothic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the audience would be home, but there would be like a handful of us there,
Yeah.
socially distanced, with people telling stories on the graves. And
So 6 feet away and 6 feet under, right? We
yeah, so good. Oh my
amazing.
God, that's brilliant. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so like the lovely ghost of Greenwood let us come in, and
Amazing.
then we were able to move into this beautiful church called St. Anne's in Brooklyn Heights,
Yeah.
which has like 100 foot like cathedral ceiling, so we could be socially distanced and safe.
Amazing.
And again, the storytellers were all together, and we'd have like a handful of friends, like pews apart, but
Yeah.
just have any kind of a live audience meant so much to the storytellers and to us. And I will never forget the first big show where we were back, which is in
That's
I believe November of 2021. It was the first time I mean, we weren't packed in St. Anne's like we were pre-COVID,
sure.
but it was the first time where it really felt like a normal show all in the
Yeah.
room, and we could have just cried, like the magic of being there together.
You can't beat it.
You
That's
can't
great.
beat it. You can't beat it.
Um, so one of the things that kind of initiated me reaching out to you for this conversation was we have a colleague at my firm and we do commercial real estate, and he kind of organized a small group of us to kind of be part of a storytelling committee, right? Like how do we as a company, how do
Yeah.
we engage with clients, right? So you spent this amazing period of your life at the Moth, but now you're kind of on your own. Like how are you helping people think about the power of storytelling, right? Like with whether it's companies, individuals, leaders, right? Like our thesis was kind of like we're all storytellers. We're telling stories all the
Mhm.
time. We just may not realize it, and we may not be putting in the work necessary to do it to the best of our ability.
Yeah, and I'll just say the best real estate agents in the world are amazing storytellers because every single property has a story. Like I bought
Yeah.
a house during the pandemic. There's a story to this house. There's a story to every house
Yeah.
I look at. There's a story to like buildings. If you're buying a big commercial building, there's always, like how did they get made? And I think people love knowing that, when
Yeah.
they're out looking, so I just think storytelling affects essentially every industry that we have. And since I've been out, I've been working with a pretty wide variety of people. My clients tend to be like high achievers in their field who have decided that they want to take personal storytelling and infuse their work with it in some way.
Yeah.
So Some of my clients are trying to do like TED Talks or give big keynote presentations, but it's so often if somebody's giving a keynote or a TED Talk that there's some personal reason why this is the subject that they've been called to speak about. And if you can tie that personal inch a little bit more, your audience is going to be so much more with you. I have clients writing memoirs where I'm helping them pull their stories out and organize them, and then they go off and write them. And then because I edited most of the Moth books, I could do like a first edit for them. A couple of people, so much fun this fall, actually hired me to direct live storytelling shows, and it was beautiful to be back in that space. I'm actually, one of the things that's special to me right now is I'm directing a solo show with Ed Gavigan, who is, I think, the only person to ever tell 3 Moth stories with the same inciting incident. And we've pulled them all together into a show that's opening in the West Village in January. So we're going to spend the holidays perfecting that. But yeah, and I'm also trying to work on stories of my own. I'm writing a memoir, and it's been really fun to see how storytelling plays out in so many spaces. I mean, my clients range from CEOs of fast food restaurants to coaches, and just like there's a pretty wide variety of people, and it's been so much fun to see how what made the Moth work applies across so many industries.
Because I feel like this kind of breaks into 2 buckets, right? One is like determining and defining your story you want to tell. And then there's the kind of like mechanics and strategy and techniques around being a good storyteller, right? Whether
I
it's
think that's right.
cadence, silence, pause, right? Like you talk a lot about that in your book. When you were kind of either coaching or directing, like how do you handle it? How do you address both buckets? Like how much time do you spend on each? Like
I would say the first half of working with somebody is just determining what their stories are, like what matters most to them, what their values are, because your values come through in storytelling. And then the second half of it is really getting them to be able to tell it. And so you always have the person who just like wants to shoot out, and they're nervous, and so they say it. It almost feels like it's all one sentence for 10 minutes. And you have to be like, put a period at the end of the sentence, like pause. Like in oral storytelling, a pause is like a paragraph, or and if you're writing, and so like pause here, then start the next chunk because it helps your listener organize it and take it in much better than if you're just like flying out. Like a lot of people talk too fast. Like I'm a fast talker.
Very fast.
So I
Too much
relate.
coffee.
So I'm like, look, it's a pot calling the kettle black, as my mom would say. But so like getting them to slow down. It's like one of the things too is like figuring out like where you can have your scenes. Like 'cause some people will tell like about a story, but the best storytellers actually at least a few moments, depending on how long the story is, will bring you into the room with them and really paint a picture of the scene, and you feel like you're there. So what are the most important moments of your story that need to be brought into a scene, and what are the parts where you can just give them a few facts and skip ahead to the next scene?
Because it's not like natural, right? I remember reading in one of the books about a comedian who was doing a Moth show, and he was kind of like, success was always like the laugh at the end of the joke, versus like at the Moth, it was kind of like the silence and the pause and the audience absorbing was actually a win. But like mentally, that's a hard thing to.
Absolutely. We over time we started to call it like you'd have to especially teach comedians who are just so used to going from laugh to laugh. We like to call it the sound of the audience leaning in.
Oh, interesting.
And you learn to feel it's a sound at the risk of sounding a little woo. There's a feeling that if you can tap into it, and it takes a little courage to tap into it, you can feel this wave of energy coming up from the audience so that even if you're telling a very serious story, you can just feel that they're with you. And so yeah, we're famous we're famous for like stripping poor comedians of their jokes, like but the thing is, the difference like with stand up, obviously it's joke to joke to joke. With storytelling, what you want is the jokes to all organically support the story as opposed to take you out of the story and become a distraction. And so determining what those are was always a big part of what we did. Yeah, Mike Birbiglia was always like, nobody has cut more of my jokes than you, Catherine. And it was like, what an honor.
What an honor. But one of the things that I also noticed was this kind of ripple effect of storytelling, right? Like, talk about what you mean by that when you talk about it. And like, because it is like this cascading, right? Like a very good story kind of has ripple impacts, right?
It does. Yeah. And like we would see this so many times where somebody would have a story and they think sometimes they maybe have shame about
Yeah.
something that happened to them and they think they're by themselves. They're the only one that that ever happened to. We would see this again and again. And then they get on stage and tell the story. And all of a sudden, at intermission, there's a line of people wanting to come up and say, oh my goodness, this
Yeah.
happened to me or this happened in my family. And I didn't realize anybody else had been through that. We've had people make decisions in their life after hearing a story and realizing like they wanted to take a chance, like they were on the fence about something. And so it can be really moving. And then especially one of the brilliant things about suddenly having the podcast and the radio show is you send that story out and suddenly millions of people are hearing it. And people would track down storytellers and
Yeah.
send them emails and say, I was so moved by your story. So we would just see how stories beget stories, because also like somebody's like, wait, I something like that happened to me. You would see it in the at the
Yeah.
in the intermission at live shows where people would be standing around drinking wine, telling their own stories. I mean, I'm sure that you've seen this because they
Yeah.
think of something after seeing a story on stage. Yeah, I know, like you, as a mom, I experienced this in one of the I think it was the very first show that I was just talking about that November 2021. I had gotten a note home from school that my then, I think like 11-year-old this teacher had told me that I might want to clean out his backpack. And I was like, oh my God. And so of course it's like sandwiches and crushed cookies and like I was just like, oh my God, I'm such a terrible mom. I was beating myself up so much. Never mind, I'm like trying to keep the
Yeah.
Moth afloat with all the rest of the Moth leadership through a global pandemic. Like it's, but I was like, and then that night, Tara Clancy, who's one of the Moth's great hosts, got on stage and she's like the mom of the year, like totally homeschooled her
Yeah.
kids, like incredible, and told a story about getting a note home from the teacher that maybe she wanted to clean out her son's backpack. And I
I
was like,
mean,
oh my God,
amazing.
I feel so much less
Amazing.
alone. That's a
I
silly
love it.
example, but it's
Well,
just
no,
like
it's a real
the
example
things
because
we,
people, yeah, you resonate with stories, right? You connect to them.
yeah. And it's like, we all are trying to be like Superman, Superwoman.
Yeah.
And
So one of the things that it's interesting, like when the Moth kind of like took off and like this narrative and storytelling, and then at the same time you kind of have like social media and like short form content and all of this stuff. Like, how do you think like the power of storytelling competes against this kind of like culture we now exist in, where it's just like faster, less, more, right? Like I almost feel like storytelling is just so much more important now because it's just like, I mean, it's harder to reach people and get them to absorb it, but like feels like a strange time we live in.
it's essential. I
Yeah.
mean, that very first night, Moth Night, that took place in George Green's living room with all his wonderful friends, 1997. And to me, it is no surprise that the rise of what I really think of as a modern storytelling movement, because
Mm.
there's the Moth, but then the Moth spawns so many other
Yeah.
organizations around, like or like inspired, or like
Sure.
those friends in that New York City living room, long ago. Um, that the rise of the modern storytelling movement has went hand in hand with technology.
Yeah.
Like I think I got my first cell phone the year that they
Yeah.
launched the Moth.
Interesting.
And that even as we were like looking down at our little devices and so in our little texts and our little things, that there was this deeply human need to go out, to be in rooms together, to connect, to listen to somebody talk for 10 minutes about like what was important to them. And then I think this is why like storytelling is really thriving right now. It's because we always need that, us
That's
versus the
fascinating.
robots.
I know.
We might win if we can like keep our hearts tied into our stories.
Well, I love this one part of the book where you talk about telling our stories and listening to the stories of other people reminds us that we're in this together, right? And then I kind of think about like, look, I'm in DC. It's a kind of toxic political time we all live in, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you think of the power of storytelling, not just the teller, but the listener, and how important it is in today's climate?
It's so important.
Yeah.
And you see this where two people, like we would, I've even seen it this fall directing some live storytelling shows where people are coming together in a room who would have thought they had nothing in common,
Yeah.
who maybe cast their vote differently in the election. And suddenly they are totally connected because they're telling vulnerable stories to each other. They're all going out on stage. You have a room full of people who, again, like might have pulled a different, you know, lever at the
Mhm.
polls, but they're so connected by people standing on stage, being vulnerable, speaking from their hearts. And it just reminds us, I mean, storytelling just fundamentally reminds us of what it means to be
Yeah.
human.
Interesting. So as we wind down, I want to be sensitive on time here. How can folks reach out to you? I mean, are you looking to help more people? Are you looking to help
I
companies,
am.
individuals? Like, give us a call to action here, because I feel like what you're doing and what you've already done is just so impactful. And
I mean, the easiest way to find me is probably right now on Instagram. It's a
yes,
little cheeky. I'm the Catherine Burns.
amazing.
So, right, like go to my Instagram, slip into my DMs. I would love to hear from
Perfect.
you. I'm always also very easy to find on LinkedIn. And I'm working on a website. But in the
Awesome.
meantime, Instagram and LinkedIn are the two best ways to find me.
And it's for anything, right? If somebody has a big presentation, a big
Yeah.
speech, a big pitch, they want to just get better and learn how to tell stories, right? I mean, like, what spectrum of stuff are you helping folks on? I mean, is it everything?
It's really everything. I mean, one of the things I really love to do is when somebody's giving a speech, it's like one of my I don't know. I guess we all have to figure out what are our superpowers is like to de-jargon a speech when people are speaking in a way that's too jargony, even for
Yeah.
their inside community.
Mm.
Is like how can we say that in a more human way that's going to actually connect with the audience? Is there a quick personal story of yours that can lead in to get people centered emotionally, where they're then going to be able to take in the big, complicated, sometimes idea that you're trying to get through? If people who think they might have a book in them, let's
Mhm.
get on the Zoom for 5 sessions, and like I can help you figure out what would the arc of that book be. Where would it
Love it.
start? Where would it end? I mean, yes, there any, but so really, it's across all mediums. Just if
Yeah.
you suspect that your personal story could elevate you in your business life in any way, call me.
And people need to stop being humble about it, right? Everybody has a story, right? I
Yeah,
think one of the things that like we were talking about internally is like it's not an ego thing. You're not bragging. It's like you have a story. It's guided who you've become. It's worth prodding and prying to dig it out, right?
oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
And in this world of like, where just everything has become so corporate and like
Yeah.
AI generated and all of the things that we're living through, authenticity is a
ChatGPT, make me
superpower.
more original. Make me more
Yeah, like
yeah,
just
doesn't work.
figuring out how to be
Yeah.
yourself and
Oh,
speak.
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for having a festive Christmas tree on our final
Thank you.
conversation
Yeah,
before
I
the
said to you
holiday
earlier, I hope
season.
it's not
I
too
mean,
Christian centric, but to me, it's like my little pagan tree. Yeah. Yeah.
well, look,
Yeah.
we're so thrilled that you're the final conversation for 2024. We've had such a blast. It's amazing to spend some more substantive time with you because it was always my wife spending time with you. So now I feel
Yes.
really excited that we've gotten to know each other.
Me
Catherine
too.
Burns, what a treat. We'll make sure we share your information with everybody listening. Folks, between now and the new year, have fun, have a festive holiday season. Visit us at coffeewithken.com if you want to catch up on past seasons. And next year, we're going to come out with a bang. It is going to be the 5th year of Coffee with Ken, which is like insane to think about. But we're gonna really step on the gas and have some exciting programming. So until then, happy holidays and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.